Act 1, I am a child. So, it is the mid-1960s, and I am 5 years old. Santa Claus is holding my hand, and we are waiting. Don't know how long we wait, 5 minutes, half an hour, an hour. We are at Santa's Village, a comparatively low-rent amusement park in the Chicago northwest suburbs. There are the relatively mild rides, a gently sloping roller coaster, a tilt-a-whirl, all seemingly around the theme of winter, Christmas, and Santa Claus. Announcements have been made. Mrs. Mooney, please come to the park office. Your boy is here. Don't know if I was crying. Don't know if I was worried. Eventually, someone comes. They arrive, not from within the park. They drive up. And I get into the car, and in the car there is laughter. That is all that I actually remember about that incident, and frankly, not entirely certain of those facts themselves. What matters about that story is what I was told about it, and what got told over and over again, and what I made that story mean in my head. My mother and aunt made the expedition to Santa's Village in the family station wagon with myself, my 3 elder brothers, at least 4 of our cousins, all piled into the car. At least 10 of us, maybe as many as 11. Nobody actually counted heads when they got back into the car, but somewhere along the hour-long drive home, somebody noticed that I wasn't in the group, and they started asking, "Where's Timmy?" And my mother, driving this mass of children back home, did not believe that I was missing. Surely it was some joke. Timmy was certainly in the car, probably hiding along the floor of that rearward-facing seat that station wagons used to have. Obviously, she eventually becomes convinced, pulls the car over, counts noses, and returns to find me in the company of some aging actor with a white beard, reclaims me, begins the long trip home again. So, what did I make that story mean? As the youngest of 4 boys, all relatively evenly spaced, 2 years apart, I was an afterthought. I disappeared. I was invisible. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was to become the source of my great pathology. It also turned into my path. Inside me, a resolve was forming to not be lost, to be seen, to be paid attention to be unique, to find my own way no matter what. Time passed. I grew. My 3 elder brothers in our large Catholic family each became altar boys, learned to play the guitar, joined the wrestling team. I did none of these. Joseph Campbell once said, "If you can see your path laid out in front of you, one step at a time, you know it's not your path. Your own path you make with every step you take. That's why it's your path." I wasn't reading Joseph Campbell back at the age of 6, but when I eventually stumbled across that quote, it made a lot of sense of my life. I did, however, spend a fair amount of time reading. While my mom may have overlooked me among the growing throng, she did eventually give me more focus as each of my brothers went off to school, teaching me to read. And I was a pretty good reader by the time I hit kindergarten. I was a good student, not a great one, never really applied myself to my studies, but I was applying myself to a lot of stuff that caught my attention, and somehow I must have begun to distinguish myself in the area of reading things aloud, because even though I was not in the advanced class of our 5th grade, I was the only one drawn from the 2nd tier to be in the 5th grade Christmas play, playing Marley's Ghost in A Christmas Carol. Still remember a snippet of those lines? "I wear the chain I forged in life, Mr. Scrooge. I made it link by link and yard by yard." My brothers all followed my father, a child psychologist, of course, into some form of psychology and or social work. I'm sure I have given them plenty to think about over the years. I remember being particularly scandalized when my eldest brother found his first job doing some sort of janitorial work in the school where my father used to work. I didn't know the meaning of the term nepotism at the time, but it just didn't seem right to me, and I knew that whatever way I made for myself, it had to be a way I made for myself. I was meant to find my career as a result of my own unique and independent efforts and qualities, just because. My sister, who was born when I was 6, screwing up the family rhythm altogether, would be disappointed if I failed to mention that she came along. My acting experiences grew in momentum through high school, as during junior year, I made the long trek from our all-boys high school to the sister school across town to audition for plays, and found myself cast in a lead role that had a kissing scene in it. That pretty much hooked me. And while I may have been good in the art of recitation, I was not so great at movement. The director would remind me again and again to get my hands out of my pockets. My unencumbered arms would find their way into a folded pattern in front of me. "Don't cross your arms," she would insist. I would proceed to grab my hands behind my back. "Don't do that." My hands would return to my pockets, and the cycle would begin again. The director insisted that I allow my hands to remain at my sides. Still uncomfortable all these many years later. I am grateful that this show predated our tendency to commit everything to videotape. Otherwise, there would be a record of my hands gripping the seams of my trousers as my disjointed shoulders would convulse with each impulse that overtook my being. I take some slight satisfaction in the fact that an "ooh" would ripple its way through the crowd during the kissing scene. When it came time to choose a major for college, I started out thinking of myself as a philosophy major. Had no idea what philosophers did to put food on the table, but I liked thinking about things, and Socrates supposedly lived to the age of 70 before being put to death, so couldn't be all bad. But even though I may have early registered as a philosophy major, by the time I made it to college, I mostly thought of myself as an English major and would eventually switch my major over. My father had poo-pooed the notion of me being a theater major, suggesting that that might be a good hobby. And there, away at school, I found myself enjoying the hobby of auditioning for plays and getting cast. Please note, I was not an especially good actor. I was an especially good interpreter of lines, but there were other actors there much more talented than me. I can think of only one who is still working in the theater. Most student actors, while they may dabble for a time in performance work, eventually go on to much more lucrative careers in real estate or the insurance industry. Seeing this, I realize that all I need to do is to wait them all out to find all kinds of great roles awaiting me in my twilight years, which should be here any minute. Towards the end of freshman year, the advisor in the theater department suggested that all that performance work that I was doing could be counting towards graduation if I managed to switch my major over, not to the English department, but to theater. I did this quietly without informing my father. It has taken him some time, but he has come around to realize that I am driven to do what it is that I do and accepts me for it, even admits to being proud from time to time. Were he listening to this talk, he would undoubtedly quietly blame my rogue profession on my mother in light of the Santa's Village incident. At the end of freshman year, I made my way back to Arlington Heights, Illinois. With no acting jobs available, I applied to work this summer at the newly opening Taco Bell. Realizing that a summer of nothing but tacos would likely turn my brain to bean curd, I decided to keep it occupied by reading my way through the collected plays of Shakespeare. It may be generous to suggest that I understood more than 50% of these plays, but it was a start. Summer after sophomore year, I worked my way through Ibsen, Chekhov, Shaw, and Strindberg, Though I must admit I never quite made it all the way through Shaw's Man and Superman. I don't believe anyone ever actually has. Shaw did, however, provide me with one of my all-time favorite quotes. "I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is sort of a splendid torch that I have got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations." Ibsen was likewise inspiring. His play, The Enemy of the People, that title should sound hauntingly familiar to you by now, concludes with the resolution that the strongest man in the world is the one who stands the most alone. That applied to my sense of, that appealed to my sense of solo self-sacrifice. Ibsen and Strindberg, from Norway and Sweden, respectively, each lived very different lives. Even though Strindberg, a much more tortured soul, had very little but scorn for Ibsen, Ibsen famously hung a portrait of Strindberg in his den. When asked why, he would always insist, "I cannot write a word without that madman looking down over me." Chekhov I loved for his many disagreements with Stanislavski, of which I have a few, who wanted to take all of his plays and his characters very seriously. They would argue endlessly over whether Stanislavski's character was meant to win the audience's sympathy. Stanislavski would point out all of the very serious lines that Chekhov gave him to say. Chekhov would counter, "Yes, but he says all of those things while wearing checkered trousers." My latest play, Man Cave, a one-man sci-fi climate change tragicomedy, features me wearing checkered boxer shorts in a tip-of-the-hat to Chekhov, or perhaps as a ploy for cheap laughs. I have no similar anecdotes about Shakespeare. There are none. I am one of those heretics who believes that someone else wrote the plays that we now attribute to the actor named Shakespeare, and that she had good reason to resist allowing her name to be published. Currently writing a play about her. Junior and senior year found me mostly on stage, generally playing small roles, not quite extras, but rarely with enough lines that memorization might be an issue. I was a skinny college student, about 120 pounds. No one was ever going to cast me as somebody's dad, which left 90% of us fighting over those same roles as teenagers, while anyone with perhaps some sign of early baldness would be cast to a degree perhaps disproportionate to their talent. I continued to explore Shakespeare, taking 2 Shakespeare classes through the English department and 1 in Shakespearean acting. One of the English professors had this habit of reading Shakespeare to us aloud. I found that pretty condescending and was pretty sure I could kick his butt in a Shakespeare recitation throwdown challenge. Or perhaps I just resented that he was getting the attention that I craved for myself. The acting Shakespeare class seemed to come natural to me, and we had a guest artist in town, the artistic director of the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. At the end of his residency, he held auditions for the festival, and I performed a monologue from Two Gentlemen of Verona, still memorized. I was one of only 2 actors from our school who was invited to join the lab internship program. I was shocked and surprised at my sudden upgrade in castability. I could barely resist a sideways sneer at my acting teacher, who had given me a B on the monologue that got me cast by a real professional. Petty? Yes. Sad to say, I still had a lot of evolving to do. And so, following my graduation from Southern Illinois University, I took an 18-hour bus trip down to Anniston, Alabama. It was my first time in the Deep South. Southern Illinois University is technically in the South, but this was uncharted territory. We interns auditioned for roles. There were very few speaking parts available. They asked if any of us could sing, and I was one of a spare few who raised a hand. It turns out that the tiny character of Balthazar in Much Ado About Nothing had a song, and so I wound up with that role. I was also cast in Midsummer Night's Dream, Theseus attendant, Henry IV, Part 1, soldier, Do Not Trust Me with a Halberd on Stage, just saying, and The Servant of Two Masters, Mime Truffaldino. I enjoyed rehearsing Balthazar in Much Ado. The theater had hired a composer who would be putting my song to music. But in the meantime, I set it to the tune of I'm in the Mood for Love, as if sung by Kermit the Frog. Why did I have to put it into the voice of Kermit the Frog? Because it made people laugh and got me more attention. Sigh no more, ladies, men were deceivers ever. 1 foot on sea and 1 on shore, to one thing constant never. It was filler, something to hold the place in rehearsal until I got the real stuff. 2 weeks into rehearsal, before the music was even composed, the director cut the song from the show. Couldn't even bring himself to tell me in person. The stage manager informed me that the song was out. I was miserable. Suddenly, I hated the play Much Ado About Nothing. It went on to become the surprise hit of the season. I really did love the play The Servant of Two Masters. The actors were funny, the action was way over the top, the new adaptation of the classic Goldoni play was clever, a handful of us lab actors were part of a recurring dance pantomime troupe during the scene changes. That play bombed. Apparently we were funny, and we also knew that we were funny, which it seems that audiences don't like. They like making that decision for themselves. At one point, following a long act or two of no laughter, somebody asks the character of Truffaldino about the name of his supposed twin brother, and he invents the name Pasquale. Sudden, unexpected, loud laughter from the audience. Standing off stage, waiting to go on, the seasoned actress turns to me with a perfect deadpan to report words with a Q. The Alabama Shakespeare Festival had a rule: no pausing. Shakespeare's iambic pentameter was the engine that drove the play, and any moment of pausing for thought or emotional expression was regarded as indulgence. I spent most of my time offstage in the green room playing backgammon with the seamstress who I had a kind of a crush on. There was a monitor in the room from which the sounds of Midsummer Night's Dream would broadcast. Every now and again, the familiar drone of the play would be interrupted by silence. And we would all look up. Silence always felt like a mistake to us, and we would all retroactively replay the scene, wondering if 2 hours of action had flown by so fast that we had missed the cue for our Act 5 entrance. One veteran actor who had been through this routine over multiple seasons was the only one without a look of panic on his face, and so we all instinctively turned to him. Once he had our attention, he would sneer with superiority, "They're just acting." And whatever you did, you didn't want to get caught acting at the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. Act 2. I decided to go into directing. I went back to the Chicago area, working at the Taco Bell while struggling to get cast. I had lousy headshots and was one of about 40 actors who would show up at auditions looking pretty much just like me. This was not that stand-out, make-your-own-path career I'd envisioned from back in the day of being overlooked in the station wagon, but directing. I went for my MFA in directing at the University of Nebraska. I did fairly well, keeping in mind that my particular talent has always been interpreting language. There is a ton of that goes into directing. I didn't much like the professor in charge of our program. I tended to contradict him and to interrupt his lectures with my own clever opinions, and I think he resented that. I did manage to direct a few shows, and my thesis play, Christopher Durang's Beyond Therapy, sold out its run and had to add an extra performance. I actually started to get some fun roles in Nebraska, as my favorite director cast me 4 times. First, as Cockney servants in The Passion of Dracula, Major Barbara, and She Stoops to Conquer, and later as Barnett Lloyd in Crimes of the Heart. Apparently, I was the accent guy, or at least that's what that director saw in me. Sometimes you just need somebody to see something in you to grasp the extent of your potential. I went on for a directing internship with the Milwaukee Repertory Theater. It was my job to read through the backlog of original scripts that had come in over the transom. I would plow my way through, drawing up a quick analysis of the play's value, suggesting whether we should hang on to the script or return it to the playwright in the SASE, self-addressed stamped envelope. Paper, copies, and postage used to be a huge expense for playwrights until the internet came along. About 80% of these plays were pretty bad, but even the really good ones tended to go back to the author anyway. Most artistic directors have a relationship with a particular set of playwrights who tend to gobble up all of the new play premiere slots in the season. Note to writers, make friends with people. Also, make friends with directors. Having friends helps. I got to work with the late, great Larry Shue in Milwaukee just as he was hitting it big. I was the assistant director on a production of his new play, Wenceslas Square, even as The Foreigner was opening off-Broadway and The Nerd was opening in London. It was my job to drive Larry to the airport and to pick him up. And he actually wanted to loan me his car while he was out of town. I expect he wanted to make sure it got started from time to time through the course of the long, cold Milwaukee winter, and it might as well be of use to a starving intern. As the season drew on, the artistic director suggested that he might want me to stick around in the coming year as the literary manager. I was thrilled and delighted over the prospect of actually earning a salary in the theater. But by the time the end of the season rolled around, the money for this new position in the company had not manifested itself in the budget, and so I was left scrambling, looking for a job. I applied everywhere I could find an opening, and found myself traveling to New York to interview for the Drama League of New York Director's Apprenticeship Program. I could feel the electricity in the room as they asked me all kinds of questions about my vision for directing and the theater, and all sorts of exciting answers would spring to my mind and spill from my mouth. While in New York, I did manage to catch Larry Shue's The Foreigner, with Larry now cast in the title role. I dropped him a note backstage as I attended with a friend, beaming with pride over the fact that I knew this amazing actor who had actually written this awesome play. After the show, Larry came out and invited us to join him for a bite to eat. I went back to Illinois, dazzled, looking forward to my brilliant new career. But heard nothing back from the Drama League of New York. No one was calling to offer me the internship. I desperately sent out more applications, and the teacher in Nebraska, the one I hadn't liked all that much, actually recommended me for an opening of a position teaching acting and stage movement at Northern Illinois University. I was offered the job. It was right about then I got a phone call from the Drama League of New York offering me the apprenticeship. One was an offer which would take me to Playwrights Horizons and the Seattle rep on a tiny stipend. The other was an offer for an assistant professor position with the astonishing salary of $17,000 a year. I asked my dad what he thought. He reluctantly shared the opinion that sure money is always a good idea. It's right about then that those student loan folks were going to start expecting regular payments coming back their way. I took the sure money and regretted it. I was pretty miserable as a teacher, probably wasn't getting enough attention. Early in that first year of teaching, I got word that Larry Shue had died in a plane crash. That was a pretty dark day. I fell into a sadness that it took a long time to climb back out of. In retrospect, I think it may have been seeing Larry playing the lead role in a play that he himself had written may have been the greatest influence on what would eventually one day become my career. After 2 years, I quit teaching to take on yet another internship, this one, coincidentally, with the Seattle Rep. I was the assistant director on a production of Moliere's Tartuffe, a 17th century French comedy in verse that had been translated into English verse. Found myself wondering how that was even possible. Once again, my reports on new plays were very popular, and by the end of the season, I was envisioning a newsletter which could distribute reports on new plays to a wide audience of artistic directors and literary managers, essentially taking what I had been doing for one theater at a time and networking it to a larger group to improve the playwright's odds. The 700 or so reviews that I published over the course of 7 years really did help to refine and sharpen my language, especially as I worked to economize on paper, copies, and postage. I was learning that there is that perfect word out there waiting for you to find it, but that sometimes you just have to keep massaging your words and reframing your vision. The script review never made enough money, so I was working at a video store and freelancing as a director to make ends meet. Eventually, I got a freelance directing gig at a tiny theater that was undergoing a change in management. And so, I stepped in as their new artistic director. Having written hundreds of reviews of new scripts, a lot of which I really liked, these became the basis of our new repertory. We were specializing in original material and had some great stuff to play with. I produced almost 50 plays over 4.5 years, directing most of them, acting where needed, and generally struggling to keep the theater's head above water. Before long, we realized that plays that people had never even heard of before inspire audiences to stay away in droves. And so, we started to work in some more familiar titles, especially during the summer months when people would rather be outdoors than stuck inside a dusty theater. We decided to do Tartuffe. I decided to try my hand at writing a new rhymed adaptation of Tartuffe. I had a vivid memory of that Seattle Rep production and imagined myself writing very funny lines into those actors' mouths. It picked up some terrific reviews in the Chicago Tribune and the Windy City Times. I quit running the theater to test the limits of this new superpower. I threw myself into writing new versions of the plays of Moliere in rhymed iambic pentameter. I wrote very fast, 12 scripts in 4 years, pausing to direct 2 of them. I soon discovered that taking on all of the production details of a play that I had also written was stressful and exhausting. And so when the 3rd summer rolled around, I found someone else to direct while auditioning myself. I found myself getting cast as Scapan in Scapan, the misanthrope in The Misanthrope, the doctor in spite of himself, and as Sganarelle in Sganarelle, or the imaginary cuckold. Yes, each was the title character of the play. No, I did not exert some sort of playwright's prerogative to get myself cast that way. I wanted those directors to use me where they thought I might best serve the production. It did happen to get me a fair amount of attention. Each of these were the roles that Moliere himself had originally played. He wrote with his own company in mind, and he wrote the most difficult roles for himself, knowing the challenge to which he would need to rise. Those directors were coming to similar conclusions about me. Somewhere between college and 20 years of working on stage, I had improved as a performer, largely without even noticing myself. I would like to pause here to put in a word for Malcolm Gladwell and his 10,000 hours theory. In short, people who are talented become extremely talented through investing long work at their craft, essentially putting some 10,000 hours into it. You can look at the careers of the Beatles, concert violinists, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Michael Jordan, many others through this same lens. So far we have established two paths to success, both furthered by working at your craft. One, you get extremely good at it over time, often without even noticing the change in yourself. Two, the competition gets bored, dismayed, disgruntled, married, or a job in the insurance industry. I did not work exclusively in the theater. I also held down temp jobs, usually while acting, directing, writing at the same time. Over the course of about a decade, I leaned fairly heavily on a day job working for a corporation that I hated. They were, in turn, owned by an even larger, more evil corporation that I hated. As a result, I think I started to hate myself a bit and put on extra weight for the first time. More importantly, my plays were getting produced, and I was doing what I could to promote them. I found myself invited to speak on the luncheon circuit, addressing the Rotary Club, the Elks, the Eagles. I would talk about Moliere, his life, his writing, our work on his writing, and wouldn't they please like to buy a ticket for the coming show or donate to the mission. I was a lousy salesman, but getting better at speaking in public. A friend was putting together a luncheon for the Canadian Women's Guild and asked if I might want to present to her group, and noted that they offer the presenter a check for $100. A free meal and $100? Awesome. She asked what I was going to do. I described my usual Moliere presentation. Oh, she sounded disappointed. Why? What did you have in mind? Well, last month we had an actress who did something called Shakespeare's Women, and the ladies really seemed to like that. They didn't want a lecture. They wanted a performance. I found myself wondering how and why Moliere might be performing all by himself. He had a full company of at least a dozen actors, and they had collectively struggled through 13 years on the road, arguments, affairs, censorship, and eventually the whims of performing for the king. Moliere himself had famously died following a performance of The Imaginary Invalid, because even though he knew he was sick, he also knew that the company needed the money, and if he took the night off, none of them would get paid. But what if the rest of the company got sick? Moliere would still need the ticket income, but what might they all come down with that wouldn't likewise infect Moliere? Food poisoning? They all had the fish, while Moliere had the chicken. Working for King Louis XIV, Moliere might need to keep some of his most popular roles on the tip of his tongue, just in case the king might have some last-minute request. He might, improvise his way through an evening of speeches, all the while switching out wigs and costume pieces. Sometimes, coming up with the ideas for your play stems from sitting in your own ignorance long enough and asking the right questions. Only then do the right answers have any chance of finding you. And so, having played 4 of Moliere's roles already, I, like him, had some pretty good monologues, more or less memorized, and could think of another half dozen that might go over very well. I had never memorized a one-man show before. When I was a kid, I saw 2 one-man shows on TV about Mark Twain and Will Rogers. I couldn't believe one person could perform all by themselves for like 90 minutes. The only thing that made me think I might be able to do that was that I already had some 20 minutes up there somewhere, and the Canadian Women's Guild only wanted 30 or so. But now, I was looking beyond the Canadian Women's Guild towards a full play that I could do for my former theater. See, they still owed me money from some salary that I hadn't collected. Yes, I spent years mostly not taking a salary because the theater couldn't afford to pay me. That's what happens when you love your job so much, you would do it even if you weren't getting paid. They could, at least, afford some costumes and props. I needed a title, and brainstorming with a friend, he suggested Moliere Than Thou? Moliere Than Thou went fairly well. But perhaps more important, I now had a large antique trunk filled with costumes. It was a very portable play. I could pack the trunk into the car and drive the show to a performance at a nearby state. For about a year, I would drive the show from Chicago to Wisconsin and back, Chicago to Tennessee and back, to my former high school, to other nearby high schools. I was scratching at a living, and with an offer to direct a show in Wisconsin, I finally let go of my day job and proceeded to lose about 25 pounds. I felt alive in a new way. I was desperate to find work and to stay out of the dreaded corporate universe. And as much as I once wanted to work with the Milwaukee or the Seattle rep, they were kind of corporate too. And I didn't want to be a cog in someone else's machine. My new work was leading me somewhere else. There was no special formula. In addition to my own occasional one-off performances, I took every job I could find. I painted a friend's house. I understudied a role. I recorded a voiceover demo and did a few commercials. I worked as a standardized patient. An actor who plays the role of a patient for a med school to test the student doctors. Quick story. I always got the dreaded assignment of the doctor's final giving bad news and had to listen again and again, as many as 80 times through the course of finals week, to the news that I had pancreatic cancer and 6 months to live. Yes, I was playing my great tragic death scene again and again to an audience of 1. If there is a sweatshop for actors, this is it. There were some specific things that the doctors had to tell me. One was that they were going to send me for a biopsy. Almost 100% of the doctors successfully sent me for a biopsy, except one. He told me I had to go for an autopsy. I cracked up laughing before I could rein it back in. The doctor did not seem to notice that I had broken character. Amid my existential crisis, inappropriate laughter seemed quite natural to him, which gave me one of my best lessons about acting. Go with that which you are honestly feeling in the moment. Do not censor an emotional action just because you think that your character would not feel that. People are weird. Act 3, the gig. An old friend from Seattle suggested that I really ought to bring my new show out to the Seattle Fringe Festival. She was pretty sure that I'd have a great time and get some exposure for my work. I applied. What could it hurt? I got in. And then I realized, driving to Seattle, 4 days on the road, paying for gas and hotel along the way, no guarantee of any ticket sales at the other end. The only thing that might make this work would be if I could line up some bookings along the way. I had already been promoting the show to schools around the country, but this time I focused on those states in between Chicago and Seattle, emailing to Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, and Washington State. In the past, I had been writing to say, hey, I'd love to come and do my show for you guys sometime, and they would sometimes write back and say, yeah, let's keep in touch, and then not. This time I was writing and saying, hey, I'm coming through town on September 7th on my way to the Seattle Fringe Festival. And since I'm going to be in town anyway, rather than my usual fee of $700, I could do a show for, say, $500 plus lodging. I lined up 4 bookings between Chicago and Seattle. My next gig had already been set for Tennessee, so I emailed those schools in between Seattle and Tennessee and lined up 3 more bookings. I was offering fewer options at a higher cost and getting more bookings, where in the past they would say, yeah, that sounds nice. Now they were going to check their calendar. This is the marketing principle known as scarcity. It's what made Beanie Babies such a craze. If the thing is only available for a limited period of time, the pressure is on to buy now. And suddenly I realized, this is the gig. At first I thought that Moliere Then Thou might help me promote my original Moliere scripts. It did that, but I was still only getting some 1 or 2 productions per semester, and one of those might pay, say, $300 in royalties. I was making more than that for a single performance, and sometimes performing 3 times in a week. This was the gig. I proceeded to plot out a tour which would take me potentially through all 48 contiguous states twice a year, fall and spring. I started in the fall of 2002. I'm still doing it today. Once again, my pathology turned into my path. Having finally come to terms with just how much I craved attention, I found a way to make my way as the lone performer on stage, the center of an attention through an entire performance that I just happened to write. And while the act of performance itself gives me a visceral thrill, there is also a profound intellectual satisfaction in expressing an idea that I brought to life and gave shape to with words. It can also be terrifying. There is no moment in which I might scratch at some awkward itch or roll my eyes back in my head to search for that word that now somehow escapes me. And given that all of my lines are written in rhymed iambic pentameter, it's a most narrow hoop through which I am diving each night. And so I have come up with ways to make this even harder. During brief moments of standardized patient downtime, in order to shake loose of that pancreatic cancer now gestating psychosomatically inside me, I wrote a short story, which would go on to receive a really great rejection letter from a magazine. I was disappointed about not getting it published, and a friend suggested, well, why don't you perform it? The story featured 4 characters. I didn't have 3 other actors along on the road with me. I memorized the whole thing, playing all of the roles. The great thing about working on one-person shows, you call a rehearsal, your whole cast shows up. I mostly rehearse while driving some 40,000 miles each year. You see me on the road, the odds are good my lips are moving. The other benefit, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. I was both the strongest and weakest link in my cast. I was going to start carrying a second play around in my head. This one wasn't in rhyme, but it would eventually feature running. I resisted running at first because I knew that I would be running in place and was afraid that people would criticize my pantomime. Note, the thing that you most fear about your performance is probably something that no one else cares about, and all of your arguments and efforts to not engage in behavior you are afraid of threatens what may be the most exciting part of your performance. My main character was running across the country and would narrate while running, projecting into the auditorium at large. Every once in a while, someone will say, "There's this one show that I saw you do," and I know right away they're talking about Criteria, a one-man comic sci-fi thriller. And they will invariably go on to say, "And you're like running throughout the entire play." In point of fact, I'm only running some 15 to 20% of the play, but the impact of seeing someone running while reciting long paragraphs is such that the running grows retrospectively. More ideas were coming to me on the road. I challenged myself to write lyrics. I wrote lyrics to a new song every day on a daily basis for a full year. I then took a year off and did it again. A total of 730 songs, some clever, fun, insightful, others not. One day, a composer found me online wanting to collaborate. I sent him some of my favorite songs. He set them to music, emailing them back to me as MP3s. Side note, I sing karaoke. Often, I find myself on the road in a town where I don't know anyone. My best icebreaker? I find the local karaoke joint, get a beer, grab a table, request a song. Very few people speak to me. And they call my name. I go up to the mic and hear the 4-click intro into my song. Suddenly, everyone is looking at me, often coming up to say hi. Given that by this time of the night I had most likely not yet written my song for the day, I found myself writing a lot of songs about karaoke. My third one-man play, Karaoke Nights, a one-man rock opera. I ran a simultaneous karaoke video which would highlight the lyrics of my songs as I sang them, karaoke style. If ever I needed to change any part of the play, it would demand a long lead time, getting back up to speed on sound and video editing, burning DVDs, before the new version would be ready to perform. After a couple of years, I let it go. It was just too much work getting it ready to perform, playing 6 different characters, singing and dancing at the same time, to have it succeed one night and bomb the next. Perhaps more important, people who come to see one-person shows may be more interested in the primal experience of seeing just what one human being alone might be capable of, not so much how one person might interact with technology. But by that time, I was working on Lot o' Shakespeare. Following a fairly good performance of Moliere Than Thou, a fellow from the audience joined me for a beer and planted a thought in my head. He said, "You really ought to submit your resume to the local Shakespeare festival, because I understand they're still looking for their Macbeth." Angels and ministers of grace defend us. I had never imagined myself as Macbeth, but somewhere along the line, I had grown out of my nebbishy, skinny undergrad self to somebody might see as Macbeth. As I said, sometimes you just need somebody to see something in you to grasp the extent of your potential. Why? Because you're already inside you and won't necessarily realize that that special something is not already in everyone else. I started to think of how fun it would be to do Shakespeare. I was already out on the road anyway and might well drop in on some Shakespeare groups to audition. And I thought about all of the monologues I could audition with. I thought of funny speeches, heroic or sexy speeches, old men, young men, women perhaps. I got caught up within this insane idea of doing one speech out of each Shakespeare play, so that whatever festival I found myself at, I could do something from anything they might produce. I worked on this project a long 4 years. Again, I sat in my own ignorance, uncertain of just what this project might want to become. My dream of auditioning turned to a new one-man play. I'd do 38 monologues, 6 sonnets, entirely at random, based on the spin of a bingo cage. The audience would all play along, each holding their own individual Iago card, and the first one to match up with 4 in a row would win, say, a t-shirt or book. 3 years into it, I still only had a dozen or so speeches in place. But performing in Alabama, having lunch with the faculty, one of whom worked with Alabama Shakes, I bragged for a bit about my new Shakespeare project. That summer, a phone call from Alabama. Hey, we really enjoyed your show, and we're wondering if you might want to come back next year. We've seen your Moliere, but thought maybe you might have that new Shakespeare show ready by then. In that moment, a choice. I could, as it were, leave some $1,000 lying there in the street. My prices had gone up a bit. Or I could stoop over and pick it up. Sure, yeah, it'll be ready by then. That quickly turned into the summer of Shakespeare, researching, choosing, monologues. At least I by then had already absorbed some of the most daunting speeches yet known to man. Queen Mab, St. Crispin's Day, Friends, Romans, Countrymen. I had no time to wonder whether there was enough room for them all. I committed to memorizing all of them, and so I did. Your best friend as an artist? A deadline. I was amazed at how well St. Crispin's Day and Friends, Romans, Countrymen were going over. I'd always imagined myself as a comic actor, but these serious speeches were electrifying. And while Shakespeare may have reworked these great speeches with his or her own brilliant words, they were once actual, real speeches that lit up the crowd. I fed the phrase, the greatest speech of all time, into the computer and studied actual historical speeches. I took my 10 favorites from Socrates on down through Martin Luther King, put them into chronological order, and came up with one-man play number 5, the greatest speech of all time, Western civilization as seen through its most inspiring speeches. Only 2 of Shakespeare's 10 history plays tend to get produced in our time. We don't really get English history the way Shakespeare's audience did. I took my 10 history speeches from Lotto Shakespeare, put them into a historical order, and was surprised at just how much sense they now made. I then doubled back to fill in the gaps with more speeches, along with some snarky narration, and came up with yet one more one-man play, Shakespeare's Histories, 10 epic plays at a breakneck pace. There's a pattern. I tend to first notice a need, like the need to understand plays that seem inaccessible. I then find out ways to satisfy that need through what will turn into a new one-man play. Performing Shakespeare's Histories at an international festival, a fella from Denmark came up to tell me just how much he liked it, but added, what I'd really like to see you do would be to focus on just one play and get deep inside of that one psychologically. Really? Which one did you have in mind? Well, I'm from Denmark. Again, someone saw something in me, and that something might well be the greatest play of all time. I put together Breakneck Hamlet, featuring all the great speeches of Hamlet with more snarky narration to whip past the slow parts. And amid what turned out to be the success of Hamlet, I just had to go for number 8, Breakneck Julius Caesar, if only to see how Friends, Romans, Countrymen makes that play explode. I snuck in just a little bit more technology with a slideshow that would flash with the lines of the mob so the audience could all get in on the fun, shouting out at the top of their lungs. How's that? Gear shift. I found myself faced with the fact that climate change not only is real, but urgent. I set literature off to the side to make use of what talents I might bring to bear to see about, saving the planet. I still perform Shakespeare and Moliere to, eat, but don't want my answer to what did you do to save Earth to be, I drove 1,000,000 miles while reciting poetry. And so, one-man play number 9, Man Cave, a one-man sci-fi climate change tragic comedy. If the planet should last long enough, I'd sure like to do a King Lear. I'm also working on a new one-man play as Isaac Asimov. Ideas for one-man plays find me. I'm alone, on the road, driving, and the wheels keep turning in my head. All I have to work with is me, and you know what they say, when all you have to work with is a hammer, everything around you starts looking like a one-man play. I've left lots of words in my wake. I've published an acting textbook, a collection of monologues, 17 Moliere scripts, and 7 one-man plays, so that maybe someone, somewhere, someday can use some of my words to chase down dreams of their own. In 2016, I came to realize that people actually want to see these projects succeed and to help make them happen. So I went not-for-profit as the Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater. Obviously, my name is Tim Mooney, and I perform a repertory of one-man plays, hence the longest company name for the smallest company imaginable. I never thought I could do one-man play, certainly never thought 9 of them. There's actually a 10th one I don't talk about much because I work with children and don't want to freak out their parents. So for what it's worth, I'm counting this speech as one-man play number 11. When they ask, how do you remember all those lines, I always say the same way you recite the Pledge of Allegiance while running through your list of things to do in your head. My mouth remembers them better than my brain does. My brain mostly needs to get out of the way. Too much thinking is bad. Almost every day, someone will say, I could never memorize a one-man play, to which I respond, as long as you declare that as true, you are right. Your ego has invested in its own assurance of that inability, and your ego relentlessly struggles to prove itself right. More important, I get to live in the moment, now, here, with people watching. I can fly or I can fall. I am more alive than I've ever been when I am present in this moment for you, with a voice that continues to make itself heard and 2 legs that somehow hold me up. Doing work that I love keeps me young. My dream is to live to my 100th birthday and to die even as the applause just reaches its peak. Or perhaps I'll grow out of that whole attention phase. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Thank you so very much. I don't know if you guys have to rush in or if you'd like to ask a couple questions or have a conversation, but you can all run away or stick around. I brought a bunch of books with me in case you'd like to see some of the books that I was talking about or read any of the plays. Anything? Question? Yes? Oh, that was a, I don't know. That was a pulling my hair thing. Yeah. Okay, well, I won't make you stay. If you want to come by and chat, that's great. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing me in. I really enjoy coming back to Northwest Missouri State University, and hope to do it again sometime soon. Have a great time. Thank you.